Hi, I'm Matt Orfalea, and today I'm happy to be joined with Chuck Keeney, college professor in West Virginia who specializes in the violent American history that you're not taught about in school, like the Battle of Blair Mountain, when over 10,000 miners took arms to fight back against their oppressive coal companies, corrupt police forces, and private security thugs, such as the notoriously brutal Baldwin-Felts agents. Chuck is also a movie star, and that's how I discovered him. He's in the recent documentaries Blood on the Mountain and the PBS doc Mine Wars. So Chuck, thanks for being with me.
Thank you for having me.
Sure. And so tell us, Chuck, what are the Mine Wars? Why is the history being suppressed? And how did you first learn about it?
Okay, well, let's take those one at a time. First of all, the Mine Wars refers to a series of violent labor conflicts that really started in the first decade of the 20th century, beginning in Kanawha County, West Virginia, around the Paint Creek, Cabin Creek area. And what you had was a system where coal companies basically had a kind of an industrial autocracy that was set up in central Appalachia, meaning that they came into regions where they found that there was coal, and they largely forced people off their land in a variety of different ways. Then they built their own company towns. And in building their own company towns, they also built the houses, the schools, the company store. They paid miners with company money, also known as scrip. And because of this, workers that were in this environment found themselves denied their basic constitutional rights. This was more than simply a struggle for unionism. This was a struggle for basic constitutional rights. You had no freedom of assembly in these towns. You had no freedom of speech. Your mail was opened. On election day, mine guards would fill out your ballot box for you. So you didn't even vote. They voted for you. You weren't paid in American money, you were paid in company money, and that money was only redeemable at the company store. So a lot of your constitutional rights are denied you, and miners began to go out on strike to try to unionize to find some way to combat this system. And eventually that turned violent. And through a number of violent strikes, beginning with the Paint Creek, Cabin Creek strike in 1912, and then culminating with the Battle of Blair Mountain in 1921, it was just almost a decade of constant kind of guerrilla warfare, which took place in the mountains. It was only briefly interrupted by World War I, in which there was something of a truce between coal owners and the coal miners. Now, why was this history not told? Why is this not in your textbook? Well, first of all, as soon before the treason trials even began. There were treason trials after the Battle of Blair Mountain. My great-grandfather, Frank Keeney, was one of the individuals that was tried for treason and murder. He was acquitted. The treason trials were actually dropped. The treason charges were dropped on him, and he was acquitted for murder for his alleged role in the uprising. And so before the trials even began, the business leaders of West Virginia and the politicians, including the current governor, who was Ephraim Morgan, and the former governor, Cornwell, John J. Cornwell, they formed a group called first the West Virginia Education Association and what they called the American Constitutional Association. And they formed these things with the specific purpose of keeping these types of incidents out of classrooms and promoting a type of what they called 100% Americanism. Therefore, they defined that as values which promoted corporate capitalism and kept out any type of ideology or historical event or anything that would tarnish this narrative of pro-corporate America. Anything that says that coal, for example, is not good for you, that coal companies aren't in the best interests of the region. And for about 5 decades, you couldn't find anything about the Battle of Blair Mountain or the Mine Wars in any state history textbooks. And it wasn't until really the 1970s that you began to see it mentioned. And even up until very, very recently, the past couple of years, it's only really come into the classroom in West Virginia. And even then, it's a little bit of a watered down version. They kind of have to wait till they get to college before they get the real story. So, and there are motives for that. There are reasons that you don't want this history to be told. First of all, it's a way of shaping attitudes of people. You can shape voter attitudes that way. For example, you can make people believe that the interest of the corporation and the people are one and the same. And of course, that's not the case here in West Virginia, but people are led to believe that what's good for coal is also good for West Virginia. And therefore, the prosperity of the company and of the state are linked, at least in the ideology that's taught in the classroom.
Yeah. So you told us some good reasons why, the history of why this violent history is not taught in the classrooms. It's not in corporate interests, and obviously corporations just not quite as severe as when they owned entire company towns back in the day. They still have significant influence over the education system.
Very.
Especially, with the Friends of Coal, you've got some crazy examples I've heard you talk about.
They have coal in the classroom in Central Appalachia, in which they come and they visit elementary schools and they visit high schools and they talk about the good things of the industry, what the industry does, how it powers America, and how it's good jobs. They go into high schools and basically tell young men that they don't need to go to college, that they need to come to work in the mines, that is where their future is, not in higher education. They also have a program where what they call women of coal or mothers of coal that come in who are wives of coal miners, and they come in and talk to the students. They give away little stuffed animals. They have a coal festival here in Madison, in which the high school students do a coal project. It's kind of instead of a science project, it's a coal project, and they have cash prizes for the winners. So it is a concerted effort. They spend a lot of money on this. They spend a lot of money on it's not just, of course, to get the notion of labor out or get the ideology of organized labor out, but it's also to get the ideology of climate change, the science behind climate change, try to get that eliminated from the classroom. Where I teach, for example, at the college I teach, probably 60 to 75% of my students believe that climate change is a hoax. So, and that's due to a lot of the educational system that they're brought up in, and this environment that doesn't really tell them their true history.
Yeah, and I would expect they also think that anytime somebody's protesting for the environment or protesting against oppressive policy from the corporations, they think it's, they're just these people, these crazy lefties, they just want to kill jobs, which they would understand is really not the case if they knew this history.
Right.
So can you tell, you explained how the kind of economic oppression and just all aspects of the town were controlled by the coal company. Can you talk about some of the violent details, like how the company would hire private security to spy and beat up and just intimidate the miners and anybody that was interested or sympathized with the union?
Yeah, it was called the mine guard system. So what you had, it was kind of like Pinkertons. If you watch old westerns, often they had Pinkerton detectives that were the bounty hunters that worked for the railroad. They would went after, like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and all this kind of stuff. Well, you had a version of the Pinkertons in the coal fields, and that was called the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency. The Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency was based out of Bluefield, and it was made up of mercenaries, bounty hunters, guys with violent criminal records, guys that didn't mind cracking a few skulls and that kind of got off on that kind of activity. And so the detective agency would hire themselves out to these coal companies, and they would be, in fact, the police force of these company towns. And I was able to find out a lot about the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency by looking at their papers. A lot of their papers have survived, and as you can find them in the Eastern Regional Coal Archives in Bluefield, West Virginia. And I went through them a couple of years ago, and you can see the letters written from the agents back to the home base in Bluefield. And the agents, they would only sign their names as like operative number 16, operative number 4. And they posed as bartenders in like the company saloon. They posed as miners. They would come into town, try to work as a miner, but then spy on other coal miners to see who was talking about the union, who might be talking about dangerous political ideologies, or who might be complaining about work conditions, or wanting to talk to a journalist about, certain violations. They even, in Mingo County, West Virginia, some of the company towns were built a little bit off the ground. It was said to protect them from floods, but mine guards used them to crawl underneath the homes and eavesdrop on conversations of families. It was also the mine guards that opened the mail. And, of course, they were the first to be there to crack somebody over the head or make somebody disappear that was a union organizer. One more thing I should add to that is the only way in and out of these towns back then was by railroad. So you had a railroad that went through the town. The only major transportation in and out of these towns was at the railroad station. So you had mine guards at each railroad station. And when you came to town, they were there to greet you, and they were going to find out who you are, what you want, what your business is in town. In Logan, where I am right now, mine guards, if they didn't like your answer, they just beat you up and threw you back on the train. They even did that to during the mine wars. The governor actually sent some people into Logan County to talk to the sheriff, and the sheriff just had the mine guards beat them up and throw them back on the train. So even when the governor would send people down, if the local authorities who were in the pay of the companies, if they didn't like it, they didn't have to bother with the governor's authority. Yeah. They answered only to the coal companies.
Yeah, I heard. Don Chafin, who we'll hear about when we talk about the big battle of Blair Mountain, he definitely did that, beat up people just for being suspected of having any connection to the union.
Yeah, he had 300 deputies in Logan County. I believe now we have 4 or 6 in Logan County.
I gotta mention, like, hearing about this private security spying on regular citizens just trying to practice free speech and freedom of assembly. Mm-hmm. It really they're working for the fossil fuel industry sounds so much like Standing Rock, doesn't it? I mean, just the parallels are pretty huge.
Yeah, it's amazing how much hasn't changed.
Yeah.
And people think of the mine wars as some kind of distant event. Even people around here that learn of the story, you have to get over this mentality that that's not the way it was, that's the way it is. So there's still so many parts of that are still alive and present in the area today. And you can find that not just in Standing Rock, but if you look internationally, look at, say, the Philippines, Indonesia, places where Exxon has big operations, and they have their own private security forces and what they do to indigenous peoples that try to fight back. You have that going on in places like Peru and Colombia. So in a lot of places around the world that we now call the developing world, you have similar sets of circumstances that were happening in the United States 100 years ago. They're undergoing their own painful, sometimes industrial transition, just like we were.
Yeah, and now in addition to going through the workers' mail and spying on them, they would actually just straight up evict and kick out anybody they suspected of working with the unions. That was a common practice. Now, after World War One, you mentioned there was a small break among the fighting, but then afterwards, an episode where the Baldwin-Felts were evicting union sympathizers in the town of Matewan. A big event happened, huge gunfight, and this is what led up to really sparked what would become the Battle of Blair Mountain. Can you tell us about the Matewan Massacre?
Yeah, the Matewan Massacre. Sometimes it's called the gunfight at Matewan. Sometimes it's called the Battle of Matewan. You can use whatever label you want there. Yeah, this was in 1920, and where the Matewan Massacre occurred in Matewan, West Virginia, which is in Mingo County. It is now where the site of our Mine Wars Museum is that I helped create. In fact, our museum is located in the very building, at the spot of the very building where Sid Hatfield and Ed Chambers and the deputies were waiting on the mine guards to come back into town. But let me briefly tell the story. Miners in Mingo, McDowell, and Logan County were the only three major counties in West Virginia that had not been unionized. In the first part of the West Virginia mine wars, the miners were very successful in unionizing. My great-grandfather and another miner by the name of Fred Mooney helped lead the miners to victory in the Pink Creek Cabin Creek strike. By the end of World War I, they had organized every county in West Virginia except for three: Logan, Mingo, and McDowell. And these were still and Logan was the number one coal-producing county in the whole state, and Mingo and McDowell weren't far behind. Matewan was in Mingo County, and Keeney and Mooney sent in organizers into those counties. In some cases, they went themselves. That's a story in and of itself, how they made it in and out of the counties without being caught. But they sent organizers into those counties. They had thousands of miners join the union and walk off the job and go on strike. Well, that's when the Baldwin-Felts detectives came in. They come into Matewan one day, and they go in the surrounding areas to begin evicting miners. Now, Matewan is interesting in that it was not a company town. It was not owned by the coal companies. And so the local chief of police was a guy named Sid Hatfield who sympathized with the miners. And when the Baldwin-Felts detectives came into town and were going to go around town and evict people in the areas right outside of town, Sid Hatfield tried to stop them. They refused to listen to him and left. And when they left, Hatfield began to deputize a bunch of people in the town, a few of them miners, and they waited on the mine guards to come back. There was a confrontation in the evening when the mine guards came back, and in the ensuing shootout, which is almost exactly like a Wild Western shootout. They met in the middle of the street. They had the argument, and then all of a sudden guns started blazing. 10 people were killed, 7 mine guards, the mayor of the town. And this led to an explosion of events which took place over the course of the next year. There was even right outside of Matewan and in the surrounding area an incident called the 3-Day Battle of the Tug. A gunfight battle which lasted on both sides of the Tug River, which lasted for a little over 3 days. State troopers were involved, mine guards were involved, and striking miners were involved. We think that there was well over 100,000 shots fired during that battle, and maybe at least 30 people killed, but we're not sure because both sides tended to bury their dead in secret. By the time you get to 1921, Sid Hatfield was murdered along with Ed Chambers, his deputy, who was there at the Matewan Massacre. Both of them were murdered in McDowell County when they were going up to a courthouse, to the courthouse steps. They were walking up the courthouse steps for a court date. A number of mine guards stepped in front of the entrance and emptied their guns into them. That was on August the 1st, 1921. A week later, on August the 7th, Frank Keeney, my great-grandfather, and Fred Mooney and Mother Jones, and Bill Blizzard, one of the other local leaders, held a meeting outside of the state capitol in Charleston. And there was about 5,000 miners, many of them armed, that descended on the state capitol, which would have been something to see. Several thousand armed miners surrounding the capitol. The governor wouldn't leave. He wouldn't leave his offices. He refused to come out and talk. And eventually throughout the course of a number of speeches, my great-grandfather said the only way you can get your rights is with a high-powered rifle. And then he told the miners to go home and await the call to march. And a couple of – go ahead.
I should mention this is after a lot of, failed attempts to, negotiate with the
yes.
mine owners.
Yes. They tried negotiating. Yeah. They tried this violence was not the first thing that they went to. They didn't immediately grab their guns, even though the notion of a gun culture is a little bit overblown here. For some reason, people are under the impression that we're all packing and we can all, go to the gun as our first means of solving a problem. And by the way, the coal companies used that to their advantage. One of the things that they did was they tried to say that the cause of the violence was these inherent cultural traits of the mountain people, that we were just backward, inbred hillbillies who take to the gun, and they weren't being violent because they were being mistreated. They were being violent because that's just who they are. It's these backwoods mountain people, and they just, they drink too much moonshine and they turn to the rifle. And that's what really perpetuated this notion of the hillbilly redneck stereotype in the American popular consciousness.
I imagine that's also really, at least partly fueled some of the miners' frustration. The fact that the national press was painting, their story as, oh, they're just some crazy gun-happy, trigger-happy rednecks. I actually found this New York Times article covering Sid Hatfield's murder. Rather than, it's not mentioning that, oh, he was a hero to the Union movement. No, he was a, quote, primitive mountaineer. And it essentially said his murder needn't spark any outrage.
Yeah.
Which is, just totally dismissing it. And of course, it did spark an outrage, to get back to where I interrupted you.
Yeah.
So what happened after this rally, after Sid Hatfield's murder? Take it.
Yeah. About 2 weeks later, miners began assembling at a place called Marmet, right outside of Charleston. And it was billed, Frank Keeney and Fred Mooney, and then later Bill Blizzard, the main leaders of the miners during this whole engagement. They really lied to the public. They kind of said that it was a spontaneous uprising, that the miners themselves just kind of spontaneously, but it was actually a highly organized affair. They had passwords. They were divided up into separate divisions, usually with a combat veteran from World War I as a head of each squad. They had supply trains. They had nurses. They had a hospital. 2 hospitals that they set up, wow. Makeshift hospitals. They had secret funds that they used to smuggle guns and ammunition. They already knew, when they were at Marmet, right outside of Charleston, they already knew that Don Chafin was setting up defenses right around Blair Mountain and on the ridge lines extending up from Blair Mountain. They already knew where his defensive positions were going to be, and they already had a battle plan set up for what they were going to do when they got there in this spontaneous uprising.
And this minor army, we might have just skipped over, what was their goal? What was this march's goal going through Blair Mountain through southern West Virginia?
Right.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it was to unionize, southern West Virginia and free a bunch of miners or union members who had been arrested under just ridiculously brutal martial law.
Right.
Under
They declared
crazy charges like bunching, which is the crime of what, Chuck? Bunching? What is bunching?
3 or more people, coming together was bunching.
Talking in a group of 3 or more. That's what you were arrested for in West Virginia, in order to suppress this union organizing. Yeah.
They arrested hundreds of striking miners. They went into the tent colonies when they declared martial law, the state police. And the state police in West Virginia were created for the sole purpose of busting this strike. They were created in 1920 for the sole purpose of helping the coal companies bust this strike. So the state police went in and they attacked the tent colony. They ripped open the tents. They stole the food. They also cut off supply lines so that the Union could not deliver food to the tent colonies. So people were literally being starved out. And then they arrested as many men as they could fill up in their little detention centers that they were putting up. So it was the immediate notion was, okay, we're going to unionize, we're going to get rid of this martial law. But also it was about ending the mine guard system totally. This, private armed system that held people down and prevented people from, just earning a decent wage and living a decent life without being, they just wanted to be to have the chance to be middle class Americans, you know what I mean? And they were being denied that because of this brutal system. And so since the state government wasn't going to help them out, since the federal government wasn't going to help them out, they felt that they had to take matters into their own hands. So they marched south with intent of going into Logan and Mingo and McDowell counties and taking care of this. Standing in between them was Blair Mountain. And so that's where the defensive positions were put in place, and that's where both armies clashed for about 4 days that fighting occurred. We still don't know how many people were killed there.
Can I ask you, is there an official date where it started and ended, Chuck?
Well, around August 26, I believe, is when the first shots were fired. Give or take, one of the was a preacher, Wilburn, from the community of Blair, and the squadron met up with a squadron of mine guards, and firing started from there. There may have been some firing before that. It was September the 1st, though, that Harding had issued his ultimatum and sent in federal troops. And so miners began surrendering when federal troops arrive right after that, because a lot of miners simply were not willing to fire on federal troops. A lot of them were veterans and had fought in World War I themselves. They didn't care to fire on state troopers, but federal troops they didn't want to do that, and so many of them either surrendered their guns or they buried their guns. There's quite a lot of buried guns up on the battlefield area, if you could get to it. Coal companies owned that battlefield area, and that's a whole nother controversy right there.
Yeah,
that I've been heavily involved in for the last couple of years.
Yeah, you should mention that at the end, like the situation today.
And getting back to this idea of inherited cultural traits, that is still a very strong part of how people perceive West Virginia and Appalachia today. The recent best-selling novel, or not novel, but best-selling, might as well be a novel, Hillbilly Elegy, that's very big on the bestseller list right now. Vance, in writing his book, really attributes a lot of the problems of Appalachia on the cultural traits of Appalachians themselves. And so it's still that same old line of it's their culture that's causing their problems. It's not their circumstances, and it's not the history that has caused things to be the way they are. It's their culture. So you still have, even today, this notion that it's the cultural traits that is the reason why there are so many problems in Appalachia and in the coalfield region. So we still haven't learned that lesson.
Yeah. That's an incredible. Now seems like you've done some serious research on the origin of the term redneck.
Right.
I learned the term redneck from Jeff Foxworthy, probably like most people.
Right.
And I've tried to figure out what the original use or definition of the word redneck, just searching the internet. Obviously, seems like it's originated maybe in Ireland or England, but as far as American history and culture, at least in addition to being, referring to a poor white person, Appalachian people themselves used it as a positive term, a proud term, which I think surprised me when I heard you talking about it. Why don't you explain that to everybody? It's a really interesting history. Yeah,
let's. Okay, it's about the red bandana. Okay, the tradition of this red bandana, and we really don't know exactly where this started. May have started in Scotland and Ireland, maybe, but The first documented case I've seen of it in the United States is the 1877 railroad strike in Martinsburg, West Virginia. There were some railroad workers wearing red bandanas around their necks as they went on strike. Later on, you have miners that began donning the red bandana, and you also had some populists out west in the populist movement in the 1890s wearing red bandanas. Now, at the same time this is going on, you also have the term redneck being used in the South to refer to poor rural whites. So a lot of this is coming up at the same time. You even had the term redneck being used in the Boer War in South Africa. Some of the Boers were referred to the British soldiers as rednecks. But anyway, as far as the red bandana, though, the red bandana, if you wore that, it was a symbol of resistance. It was a symbol of worker solidarity and kind of fighting the powers that be. Farmers used it in the Midwest in the populist movement, and you had coal miners using it. And they referred to themselves as rednecks because of that. But to them, the word redneck wasn't, it wasn't about having a rebel flag and screaming "get her done" from a pickup truck, right? This was about resisting these powerful corporate forces which were dimming the constitutional rights of the people that were living in these areas. And so it was a badge of honor. I think this is a story I've told before, but I think it bears repeating. Whenever I taught at West Virginia University when I was getting my doctorate, I had a lot of it was far more diverse, my student population was, than what it is here where I teach in the coal fields. And I would often have students, particularly African-American students, write down a description of what they thought a racist was, a physical description. And I always got the exact same physical description. It was the description of basically a redneck guy with a pickup truck, lives in a trailer park. That was the consistent idea of what a racist is a redneck. The idea of redneck and racist are synonymous in many cases in our society. You go back to 1921, the miners, whenever they marched south, they actually desegregated everywhere they went. They went into Madison and Danville and desegregated the restaurants. They made the cooks serve whites and blacks and immigrants together. They went into the town of Sharples. They found a company cafeteria, and they forced the company officials to serve everybody in the same room. Now, when this is 1921. This is a generation before Rosa Parks, well before Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And this is at a time when the KKK was really resurging in America, when you had anti-immigration really as a big deal in the United States in the early 20s. And yet the supposed rednecks in West Virginia were a generation ahead of their time. And because we don't know that history, because the companies won the conflict and are able to write the story, the notion of a redneck as a racist has become the dominant part of the narrative, as opposed to what it originally meant going back into 1921. The rednecks were actually the least racist ones around. I don't mean to say as though they were creating some kind of workers' utopia where everybody was going to hug and sing Kumbaya together. They still had their differences, and it wasn't like there weren't tensions. But at the same time, they were far ahead of their time. And had the miners won that conflict, we might use the word redneck in a far different context today. Yeah,
that's incredible history that I think people should hear about. Because especially, nowadays, it's really clear that there's a lot of divisiveness, just between people from all backgrounds and races and ethnicity, that really seek to generalize and demonize the other side. And I want to share one other detail. Maybe you can expand on this, but just an example of the Blair Mountain Rednecks being so incredibly progressive. They fought with black miners, right? And some of the black miners even had positions of authority.
Yes, yes. Yeah, some of them were union organizers. Some of them were even placed in charge of squadrons, which that was very scary to the powers that be in 1921. The idea that you had blacks and whites, on the same side arming themselves. Yeah. That was very scary to some people. One of the more prominent guys was a guy with the nickname Few Clothes Johnson. We have one of the few surviving pictures of him in our Mine Wars Museum. But he was closely connected with a lot of the union leadership, was a union organizer, played a strong leadership role in both the Paint Creek, Cabin Creek strike, and then later on, at Blair Mountain. And so, they understood that they were in the same boat. They didn't, again, it wasn't like some kind of utopia, but they understood that when they all went down into the black hole together underground, that when a mine shaft collapses, it doesn't care what your ethnicity is or what your background is. When somebody's voting for you or paying you in company money, that doesn't really. They were all in the same boat. And they all worked in the same little towns, and they all went down into the same hole. So those commonalities outweighed their differences.
Yeah, and just to put this in perspective again for the audience, this is like at least 30 years before the U.S. military was really desegregated. This is incredible.
Right.
Let's see.
Right.
Okay, you've got to go to class. Let's wrap this up. How can why don't you tell us what's going on with Blair Mountain today?
Right. So the coal companies want to destroy the battlefield with the practice of mountaintop removal coal mining. And if you're unfamiliar with that process, that's when they take the entire tops of the mountains and blast them away. And
just want to blast to blow up the entire history of Blair Mountain. All right.
Yes, absolutely, they do. And I've met with the executives at Alpha Natural Resources, at Arch Coal, and Natural Resource Partners. Those are the three main companies that are responsible for this. I've met with them. I've met with their executives. And they do not want this history being memorialized. They don't want a monument to the United Mine Workers of America. They do not want a monument to union rights. They don't want the coal companies looking bad in any way, shape, or form. And the easiest way to make sure that happens is to blow it up. In 2011, I was one of the people who helped organize this coalition of groups. There was quite a few groups involved, quite a few organizers too. A 50-mile protest march that went from Marmet to Blair. It was a week-long protest march that retraced the exact steps of the miners in 1921. Since that time, I've been with a group called Friends of Blair Mountain, and we have taken the coal companies to court in 3 separate cases. We won a federal case, and we're currently waiting on a decision from the keeper of the National Register to see whether or not Blair Mountain is going to be put on the National Register of Historic Places. If it is, then that will protect it from surface mining. If it is not, and we're going to find out probably in October is when we're expecting a decision, so stay tuned for that. Yeah. If it's not, well, then we may have to resort to other means to try to prevent them from blasting the site. Now, it isn't as though they're going to blast it tomorrow because, they have to move in the equipment. They have to get everything ready. And they have permits in this whole permitting process that I've become heavily involved in. I've learned more about coal permits than I ever wanted to in trying to preserve this battlefield. But we're working to do a lot of things to try to slow them down, to try to ensure that there is at the very least an archaeological survey of the battlefield in order to identify important areas. We want to do a LiDAR scan of the battlefield in order to get an infrared, look at where all the defensive entrenchments were. So in the meantime, we're trying to tell the story by creating this little museum that we have down in Matewan and promoting the history. We figure that the more we promote the history, the more people will care about it. The more people will care about it, the harder it will be for the companies to get away with blowing it up.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, unfortunately, with the Standing Rock as an example, it shows coal. If the fossil fuel industries, they, even if they don't have a permit, that's not going to stop them. I mean, that's scary stuff.
Yeah.
So, so all the more important for people like you and everybody out there to be doing the work you do, sharing the information, sharing the story of Blair Mountain, and hopefully we can continue to protect it. You want to tell everybody like a website they can go to?
You can go to wvminewars.com. That is the website of the Mine Wars Museum. That can kind of keep you up to speed. Friends of Blair Mountain, we did have a website, but the West Virginia Coal Association and others have hacked it so many times. We've kind of given up on that. So we kind of operate offline mostly. But keep looking in the news because as soon as there's a decision from the keeper, it will be up in the news. But you can check out the Mine Wars Museum online or their Facebook page, and we have a lot of events and things going on, and you can kind of keep up to speed with some of the things we're doing there.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Chuck, for joining me.
Well, thank you. And, thank you for having me.
And go teach those kids about the history of Blair Mountain.
I'm going to try to.